When your country's taken over by an authoritarian government, what would you do to resist? Welcome to the depths. Welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me today. Today, I have a review of City of Last Chances by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, I read this as a buddy read with Alex from Alex Unabridged, and I'm going to say right out of the gate, I loved this book. I thought it was great. I was really excited to do this buddy read. You know, Alex has been reading a lot of Tchaikovsky this year. I think he's read more than a half dozen books, but he is focusing on sci-fi, and fantasy is not really his wheelhouse. Now, I have meant to be reading Tchaikovsky for a long time. I actually have his Children of Time series, as well as his Final Architecture series, as well as some of his standalones. I have digital copies of all of those waiting for me to read them, and I just haven't gotten around to it. I don't know why. So I saw an opportunity to get the advanced reader copy of the third book of this series. This is the first of the Tyrant Philosopher series. And so I saw an opportunity to get the third book, and I said, well, that will force me to read the first two. So once I went for that opportunity, I got in touch with Alex, and we decided to do a buddy read. We thought it would be a good contrast with him being so familiar with Tchaikovsky, but not reading a lot of fantasy, and me having read a decent amount of fantasy, but haven't read any Tchaikovsky yet. And I think we both agreed that we loved this book. We thought it was great. So this review is just going to be me kind of singing lots of praises. But anyway, what is it about? So the City of Last Chances is Ilmar, and it is like a city-state, and you can picture the setting as kind of like right around the time of the Industrial Revolution, late 18th century, early 19th century, like this. I think Alex described this book best as really, it is a fantasy book, but it's more like historical urban fantasy. So it takes place in that time period, and the fantasy elements are not at the forefront of the story. They all are kind of powering it from the back, and because of that, even for someone who isn't especially well-versed in the fantasy genre, you can pick this up and it won't be overwhelming for you. I thought the fantasy elements added a great amount to the story. So the city of Ilmar, where the story takes place, is under occupation by an authoritarian government. The authoritarian government is the government of Palisand. They are a nearby nation, and they have developed a means of perfecting society. And once they reached perfection in their own country, they started spreading it out to other nations and city-states around them. And they occupied Ilmar and have been there for over 3 years. With their occupation comes the eraser of your own language, of your culture, of your religions. None of those are allowed because they are against perfection. Tchaikovsky's language in this is actually really great. He uses this amazing Orwellian language. The Palisand authority, the central authority, is called the Temporary Committee of Ends and Means, because of course, once you reach perfection, you won't need this committee anymore. Everything will work on its own. But, you know, since perfection always needs to be spread more, this committee will keep going on a little longer, even though it is the temporary committee. And the different factions of the government that rule different parts of society are called the School of Correct Thought, or the School of Correct Erudition, the School of Correct Speech, and so forth. And these are the different governing bodies that are part of the occupation. So you have the occupiers, the PALs, they're called. Within Ilmar, you have all these different resistance factions, and they take different shapes. Some are the part of the university, both the scholars and the students. Some are the wealthy elite who used to run Ilmar before they were basically deposed by the PALs. Then you have the working class or the working poor, and they have trade unions that are called the siblingeries, and they have their own type of resistance. And then you have the criminal underground, who are also their own type of resistance. And then you just have the people trying to live their everyday life. And so because of this, you have all these different factions within the city who all want to escape the yoke of occupation, but at the same time, they want to make sure their faction is the one that has some semblance of power and authority when the occupiers do finally leave. And so the plot of this book is simply following these different factions as they have these large or small acts of resistance against the occupiers. And because of that, the story really is about Ilmar. It really is about the city. The city itself is its own character. And I say that because the character list is broad and expansive. And the way the story is written is almost every chapter is from a different perspective. Especially the first dozen or so chapters, you meet a new character after a new character after a new character. Every chapter you're jumping from one character to another. And it isn't until more than a dozen chapters in that you repeat a character. And I will say because of that, I was a little worried at the beginning because I really care about character. Like having characters that I feel invested in is important to me when I read a book. Most often, not always, but when I read a book, I really want to feel invested, like I have some stakes in this character. It doesn't mean I have to like them. It means I have to be interested in them. And when you move from character to character so frequently, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to develop that level of investment. But Tchaikovsky is masterful in the way he weaves these characters' lives in and out of each other. So even though you jump from character to character, you see all the characters in the other characters' stories more often than not. And because of that, you see different perspectives of each character. You see them from the inside and from the outside. And I really fell in love with these characters. I thought his characters were incredible. As by about halfway through, I realized I was overwhelmed by how much I loved all of these characters, even the ones I hated. The wonderful part about this structure is that some of the chapters, many of them are characters you only see once. They are bit characters that have a role to play that may cross others' paths, but they aren't part of the central story. However, they are part of the story at the same time. Some of these are really fun because even in the most minor of characters, Tchaikovsky gives them so much depth, so much meaning. They're so well rounded. Not a single character in this book, including some unnamed characters that play pivotal roles yet don't even have names. None of them feel like archetypes, and none of them feel boring or stiff. All of them feel complicated. Because at the same time that you're playing with these different factions, you have all these issues of class, all these issues of social status, all these issues of immigrant status, and so forth, playing into how these factions operate within each other and how they negotiate their life under occupation and what their type of resistance will look like. I thought the style did a great job of building up these characters, and there were a lot of them. If you struggle with large casts and you struggle to keep track of people, then this book may be a little bit of work for you. I mean, there even is a list of characters in the beginning, dramatis personae, and it's 2 pages long. So you get 2 pages just of the characters, right? Listing who they are and what their affiliations are. So there are a lot of characters to keep track of, but they interact so often. I never found myself struggling. I never felt confused about what character was doing what, who they had loyalties to, what had happened to them the last time I saw them. And the way the story moves, he would invest you in a character's actions, and then that chapter would end and you'd move to another character. And part of me would want to continue to see where that character's story was going. But then I was so wrapped up in the new character he presented that I never felt disappointed. He won me over chapter by chapter by chapter every time. The world itself felt like its own character. I really thought Ilmar was phenomenal. And I will say, one of the most beautiful bits of world building was very early on in the 3rd chapter. There was a game of chalk, which is a type of game that you gamble on. A game played, it sounds similar to Mahjong, basically. And so you have this group of people gambling, and they all come from different factions and different walks of life. And our character is the one that owns the inn that they are all gambling at. That's the point of view we have. And as she's assessing all the players, she's talking about them and thinking about them. And that is giving you pictures of the whole world, the whole city of Ilmar, piece by piece by piece, as she analyzes the different players at her table and how they might play and what her relationship is to them. So I thought the world building was so beautifully done. That was the first example of it. But throughout the whole novel, he has this really exquisite world building that has no info dumps. There isn't a single exposition dump in the whole story, and yet you know what's going on. You don't know it all right at the beginning, and there are still a lot of questions by the end, but you don't feel like the world is missing anything. Because of that, most of this world is focused on Ilmar. You know there are other nations. You meet the pals, obviously, who come from Palisand, and you meet a couple characters that come from neighboring nations, some that come from Alor, which was also conquered by Palisand. So a lot of them are refugees or immigrants in Ilmar. And then you have a couple people from a few different nations as well. So you know a little bit about them and about how they exist, but you don't know a lot about the world outside of Ilmar because Ilmar itself is so dense. It is so layered. There's so many different districts. There are so many different classes of people and types of people that you get to learn all about the different districts in Ilmar. And I never felt the world was lacking. I always felt like Ilmar itself was a character in the novel. And while I was aware there was a larger world, there was more happening outside of Ilmar, I never felt like Tchaikovsky wasn't aware of it. It just wasn't the purpose of this novel. So I thought the world building was incredibly expansive and really detailed. And again, if you have in your mind this picture of Central Europe, maybe London or Manchester around the time of the Industrial Revolution, then you're going to have a picture of what this world looks like. No electricity, cobblestone streets, and that level of technology, more or less. But then that is mixed with just a little bit of magic, just a little bit of sorcery. For instance, they have factories, and their factories are powered by demons. They have these contracts with demons that become essentially enslaved labor to power the machines in their factories. So there are small little touches like this. Alor itself, the nation of Alor, who have a bunch of immigrants in Ilmar, are sorcerers. And so they have different types of magic that they are able to perform. And then you find out in Ilmar, on the border of Ilmar, is what is called the anchor wood. And during the day, this just seems like a small copse of trees. But sometimes in the evening, it becomes this infinite wood that is some sort of portal to other realms. And all you know is that when you go in that portal, if you don't have proper protection, then there are dangerous beasts that will rip you apart. you have all of these kind of fantastical elements on the outside, but the heart of the story is this struggle against occupation, the struggle against what it means to have your culture, your life, your identity stripped out of your control. And how do you negotiate that? Now, Tchaikovsky's writing is brilliant. It is not very florid. It is not very purple in any way. It is very kind of straightforward and direct. Yet it has this kind of edge to it where it's got this darkly sardonic tone all the time. And it has like this smugness to it almost, which I think is beautiful. It matches the text perfectly. And it has these really great moments of humor and of this really dark kind of humor that I laughed out loud numerous times throughout the book. And at the same time, there are these moments of really beautiful prose, just these lyrical examples where it might be a line or two that ends a sentence, or a character is trying to understand his thoughts. And the way it is phrased, like the choice of words and just the way they're structured, is really, really striking. So he takes this very straightforward prose and he mixes it with this really great underlining dark humor and just a little bit of smugness mixed with some really beautiful prosody that works so well. It is such a pleasure to read. Like, I didn't ever want to stop turning pages just because the writing itself was such a joy to read. And the structure of it, I think, is also great because, as I said, every chapter is from the point of view of a different character. Yet, at the beginning of each chapter, you have maybe one paragraph that is from an omniscient narrator's perspective. And that omniscient narrator might be filling in some background information about the character, whose point of view you're about to follow, or about the situation, or maybe a little bit of the history of the city that has some relevance to the chapter you're about to read. And then once in a while, there are these chapters that are called mosaic chapters, where they basically take a bird's eye view, where the omniscient narrator's voice is most predominant throughout the whole chapter, and it flits from one part of the city to the next, tying all these threads together, making sure that you know everything is connected. You see how they are crossing paths and sometimes helping and sometimes hurting each other in their types of resistance. So not only are the characters and the world building incredible and intricate and very, very multi-layered and exciting, but the writing itself is a joy to read. And having this omniscient narrator voice in just brief little snippets mixed with these individual characters who all sound unique, who all have their own voice and their own way of engaging the world, really makes the book feel cohesive, even though it is like a type of cohesive chaos. This city is in chaos, which is what would happen under occupation, especially when rebellions start happening. And you might be planning your act of defiance, but when another group sets up their act of defiance, you don't have any choice. Like, the fire's already lit, you have to go with it. So they are living in this chaotic state of being. And so to have the book feel chaotic makes sense, but it never feels out of control. It feels like there is some sort of enclosure around this chaos that Tchaikovsky is weaving for us. And it was such a joy to read, following it every direction it went, all the twists and turns, and the way that magical ideas crept in, and the way that optimism and naivety crept in, and the way that cynicism and violence, they all were part of this mix, you know? And we do have a couple main characters that eventually the story cycles around. A young student who's incredibly optimistic and naive, a thug who doesn't know anything but violence, a scholar who is jaded and is concerned more with his legacy than others, an immigrant who is really focused on his community and how making sure his community is taken care of, and he might have a little bit of sorcery up his sleeve. The head of the siblingeries, or one of the heads of the siblingeries, which are the workers' unions. So you have these few central characters that you return to time and time again and see how they interact with different acts of rebellion and resistance. And so the plot itself is just that. There isn't a strong narrative going throughout, except that it's these different factions acting against authority. And I think what's most beautiful is there are so many ideas layered in this story that any given idea, you could just sit there and think on it for days, especially the way he gives you this really, really beautiful language describing these ideas. You know, the first chapter you meet is with a priest, and this priest is of a religion that is illegal, and he bears his faith with this burden, this loneliness that also is what empowers him. And so this idea of the loneliness of faith, yet how it empowers you to engage in the world around you and understand your life, I think is a really interesting theme. This character, Yasnik, is such an incredible character for the way his relationship to his God and the loneliness that it brings upon him and his position against the occupation as a result of that, I think is a profound way to start the book. But on top of that, you have all these ideas of what it means to rebel against authority, what it means to have solidarity, I think is the important thing. And at a time like this, when the world is seeing more and more authoritarian or authoritarian-like governments take control, it could almost be a downer to read this book, right? But what I found really compelling and engaging about this book, and almost optimistic, is because Tchaikovsky does a great job of showing how fragile authoritarian power is, because it's power that is ruled by fear. It is power where everyone involved is always looking over their shoulder. There is no coherence, there is no solidarity among all of the people in power. Everyone is searching for more power and using fear and violence as their only ways to execute their power. Because they misunderstand, they think that fear and violence are power when they're not. Solidarity is power. But since any type of authoritarian rule is based on fear and violence, it is inherently fragile. And you see that as all of these different factions of resistance are poking at the cracks in the PAL's authority and seeing where they can make their holes wider, where they can make inroads. Unfortunately, you also see the fragility of resistance, because resistance also needs solidarity, right? And so when you have all these factions, when they're able to work together, what they're able to achieve is a lot different than when they're working for their own ends. When they're not concerned as much with overthrowing authority or overthrowing the occupiers as much as they are taking the occupiers' place, right? They want to be back on top of the heap. They don't really care who they are working against, as long as they end up on top. And so when you see a lack of solidarity within any sort of resistance movement, then you see they are just as fragile as the authoritarian government itself is. At this time in our world's history, I think it is really empowering to read a book like this. Makes me feel optimistic, and it makes me realize how important solidarity is, how important it is to grapple with who you want to be and how you want to create connections to other people. So what we have to do as people who are looking to resist authoritarianism, who are looking to resist the forces that are trying to occupy our minds, our culture, who are trying to delegitimize our existence, is we have to find solidarity wherever we can. If we act as individuals and if we act without the backing of community, then we are going to be as weak as the governments are trying to overthrow. We'll be just as fragile. So we need to find solidarity. That is what this novel reminds me of. And I think that he displays these ideas so well alongside these ideas of faith, and he uses magic and demons and curses and portals to other realms of existence. He uses these fantastical means to give the characters in the story enough flavor to be exciting and interesting, but at the heart of the story is their human struggle. If you can't tell, I love the story. I could ramble on about it, and reading it as a buddy read with Alex was great because the two of us did ramble on and on and on. I am excited that we are going to buddy read the next two books in the series as well. Next month, we're going to be reading The House of Open Wounds, which is the second book. And then in February or in late January, we're going to be reading Days of Shattered Faith, which is the third book. And that book has been released in the UK already. It was released in early December, but in the US, it's not being released until March. I desperately want to jump right into the second book right now, but I have so many other things on my plate that Alex has very graciously accepted to delay gratification and wait until January so we can buddy read it at that time. And I'm really excited for it. I think these books are phenomenal. It's a great introduction to me to Tchaikovsky's writing and his writing style. And the world he builds is just so compelling that I want to spend more and more time there. I think having this broadcast of characters does a great job of showing that the city itself is the main character, and these are all players on that board. It isn't one simple narrative. It is the narrative of Ilmar and of what it looks like to exist under occupation. That is the narrative. And you see how a half dozen characters engage with that. You see what rebellion and resistance looks like from different points of view, and how, when those points of view don't always agree, what can be the consequences. When there isn't a firm solidarity within the different resistant factions, then what happens to your rebellion as a whole? And are you able to move forward? These are the ideas being played with. This is the narrative that we are following. We are looking at what it means to rebel against authoritarian governments. So with that, I loved the story. I'm not going to ramble on anymore. This came out in 2022. The sequel came out in 2023, so I'm sure some of you have read it. I'd love to hear what you thought about it and what you think of any of Tchaikovsky's other writing as well, any of his sci-fi. I'd love for those who have read both to say what they feel the relationship between his sci-fi and his fantasy is, because I'm interested next year in to start reading more of his sci-fi. So I'd love your thoughts and recommendations down below. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Be kind to yourselves. Take care of each other and go slowly.